Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar on REACH authorization and the aerospace supply chain, where we will be discussing your obligations and how the aerospace sector is working to understand the use of critical substances such as bisphenol A, HHPA and MHHPA, as well as the scope of potential future regulatory requirements. This webinar is hosted by Workgroup 5 of the International Aerospace Environmental Group. My name is Tom Persich and I am facilitating the running of the event today. I'm now going to pass over to Erin Yeager, Chair of Workgroup 5, who will say a few words before we play to you a 30-minute presentation that we have prepared. This will be followed by a question and answer session with a group of expert panelists on the line. So Erin, over to you.
Hello everyone, my name is Erin Yeager and I'm the leader of IAEG Workgroup 5 on REACH authorization, and I'm going to be acting as the moderator for this webinar today. The IAEG Workgroup 5 has developed a toolbox of processes, standard dossier content, standard consortium agreements, and lists of service providers that any of our workgroup members can use in the future to launch an authorization consortium or to take with them when they're joining an authorization consortium that gives a consistent industry message to be included in future authorization applications. We also proactively instigate market analyses of substances that are key to our industry, often in advance of any decision to include them on Annex 14 of the REACH regulation. We do this to better understand their uses in the aerospace industry and where we fit in the overall uses globally. We also seek to understand how the development of alternatives is progressing. This webinar is the first stage of that process and is a precursor to a supply chain survey that will shortly follow. The webinar is designed to give an overview of the authorization process, explain the requirements of an authorization, and where different actors in the supply chain fit in the process. There are elements that some of you may consider too detailed for your specific needs, but I ask you to please recognize that we're presenting to a wide range of companies with different potential levels of involvement within REACH. Before we begin the presentation, I do need to point out to you that we would like you to submit questions as they occur to you during the presentation rather than waiting to the end. But we all have to comply with competition laws. And to that end, I need to take you through the IAEG guidance related to your obligations when submitting questions during this session. The Q&A session in this webinar must be conducted in compliance with competition laws and IAEG compliance program, including without limitation the following guidelines. All questions and/or comments addressed during this webinar or related to this webinar shall not suggest or facilitate discussions on pricing or pricing policy, or other constraints on competition of any kind, including but not limited to trading terms with any customer or supplier, stock levels, volumes, or sales figures. We shall not engage in discussions that could lead to a boycott of a supplier or a customer, shall not encourage or facilitate any attempt to divide customers, restrict products, sales conditions, or in any way alter the business of another participant or an IAEG member. Participants shall not discuss or suggest any form of coordinated reaction to customers or to other suppliers. Participants shall not refer to a particular customer or supplier by name, or to refer to any information that allows the identification of a company or the identification of a business relationship between an IAEG member and a supplier or customer. Participants shall not exchange any information that allows them to identify a company's competitive information, including pricing and strategic planning. And any question and/or comment made by a participant shall be made in a form that prevents the identification of the participant or its business relationship as a supplier or business partner of any IAEG member. So if you have a specific question for a customer or a supplier who is a Workgroup 5 member, I encourage you to contact them directly. And if you ask via the question box that Tom will describe in a bit, he can respond to you with the company of interest Workgroup 5 representative. You can alternately find a list of all of Workgroup 5 representatives on our website, for which you will have a link at the end of this presentation. We also want to stress that none of the questions that are asked can include export-controlled information, any participant or third-party proprietary information, and none of the answers or comments provided the Q&A question constitutes legal advice. IAEG does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the information presented or the opinion or comments made during the Q&A sessions. Any particular concern related to the information presented in this webinar shall be reviewed with your own legal counsel. I shall add that all questions you submit go to our independent consultants who vet them for compliance before forwarding them to myself. I will now invite Tom Persick from RPA to explain how you can submit questions during the webinar.
Okay, so thanks very much, Erin. Submitting questions should be a straightforward process for you. There should already be a questions box on your screen that has opened, but if not, you can click on the small red arrow button on the Go to Webinar control panel, which should be on your screen, and that should bring the questions box about. So without further ado, we're now going to proceed with today's presentation. Thank you. Hi everybody, my name's Tom Persich and welcome to today's webinar where we will be discussing bisphenol A and the cyclic acid anhydrides HHPA and MHHPA. Specifically, we will discuss the potential implications for the aerospace industry of their possible future inclusion on REACH Annex 14 and the steps that we are taking to mitigate any associated risks. We will start the webinar by providing a general overview of the REACH authorization process to highlight why action is needed. We will also explain the preparatory activities being undertaken by Workgroup 5 of the International Aerospace Environmental Group, the IAEG, to allow for these substances' continued use in the aerospace industry, and why the involvement of our suppliers, in other words, you, is absolutely essential to this process. This presentation will run for about 30 minutes and it will be followed by a question and answer session with the aim to finish up within an hour. We've also had some pre-submitted questions which we will answer, and as participants you're able to submit questions during the webinar using the question box on your screen. You may also like to know that a recording of the webinar along with all the slides and some useful links will soon be available on the IAEG Workgroup 5 website. So without further ado, let's get started. So, why should you be listening today? Well, over the course of this webinar, we will provide an overview of the REACH authorization procedure, following the journey a substance will take, the typical timescales, and the resource requirements from your perspective as a business. We will discuss the various practicalities of submitting an application for authorization from the different points of view within the supply chain. We will explain the challenges facing the aerospace industry, which are rather unique in many aspects and which we are sure will ring true with many of you. We will go through the process of how substances are included on REACH Annex 14 and what this means. Finally, we will outline the efforts that IAEG is taking to plan for any eventual future REACH authorization that may be needed for BPA, HHPA and MHHPA. And we will also identify how you can participate to help verify that your products or your own uses of these substances are properly considered. For those of you who have attended one of our previous webinars, some of this information may not be new to you. IAEG Workgroup 5 appreciates you joining and believes that a brief reminder on the REACH authorization procedure is worthwhile. Before we go into these details, we're first going to tell you who IAEG are, and in particular highlight the activities of Working Group 5 on authorization. So, who are we? The International Aerospace Environmental Group, or IAEG, is a trade association that was formed in 2011 by a group of major aerospace companies. IAEG's vision is to advance innovative environmental solutions for the aerospace industry
and IAEG is a leading global aerospace forum for sharing good practices on key issues and developing voluntary consensus standards around the environment sphere. The group focuses on a multitude of global laws and regulations, which are often highly complex and variable, and REACH is one of these. More generally, IAEG seeks to drive continual improvement in the processes used throughout the industry. So, at a glance, our organisational structure of IAEG consists of a board of directors and, at present, 8 working groups. Each of these has been established to address separate environmental issues. Today's webinar has been organised by Workgroup 5, who focus specifically on REACH authorisation activities. So, just to give a little bit more detail, Workgroup 5's mission is to create a body of knowledge and expertise in the international aerospace industry that will collaboratively work to support REACH authorisation activities for global business continuity, and to assist member companies in performing their business continuity risk and assessing their need to support new authorisation applications for substances of very high concern. So, what is the authorisation procedure? The authorisation procedure is described in Title 7 of the European Union's REACH regulation. It is one of the core processes under REACH for managing the risks of hazardous substances. It aims to ensure that the risks from substances of very high concern, or SVHCs, are properly controlled and that these substances are progressively replaced by suitable alternatives, without introducing unwanted disruptions to the functioning of the internal market. Another way of saying this is that it aims to ensure that alternatives are implemented, but only when they can be considered both technically and economically feasible. So, substances are added to the authorisation list via a 2-step process, whereby a member state from the EEA, or the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA, initially proposes that an SVHC be added to the candidate list for authorisation. In the second step, a substance might be included in the authorisation list itself. Such substances that are on the second list cannot be placed on the market or used in Europe after the so-called sunset date, unless an authorisation has been granted for a specific use or the use has been exempted from authorisation. At present, in December 2018, there are 43 entries on the authorisation list and 191 entries on the candidate list. Each entry represents either an individual substance or a family of substances. All authorisation decisions will define a time-limited review period. Now, typically, these have been 4, 7 or 12 years, and holders of authorisations must submit a review report at least 18 months before this review period ends if they wish their uses to continue. In addition to this, an authorisation may be reviewed at any time if the circumstances of the authorised use change or if new information on potential alternatives becomes available. So, just to recap on how a substance makes its way onto the authorisation list, here's a diagram documenting the 2-step process discussed on the previous slide. Now, more additions to the authorisation list are expected imminently, and due to the 2-step nature of the process, we are also able to track the journey a substance will take. Considering timescales, the period from the submission of an Annex 15 dossier, which proposes that the substance becomes a substance of very high concern, until inclusion in the candidate list, the first step, is usually expected to take between 5 and 10 months. From inclusion in the candidate list, there is no set time under which a substance has to move to the authorisation list, and many may never do so. Instead, substances are prioritised based on criteria set out by REACH, which states that priority shall normally be given to substances with the highlighted levels of concern when it comes to their human health and environmental properties, along with the nature and volume of their use. In essence, the purpose of the prioritisation is to ensure that the more relevant substances are included in Annex 14 before the less relevant substances. Now, where your company sits in the supply chain may dictate the role that you might need to have in an application for authorisation. It affects different companies in different ways. A manufacturer, an importer, or a downstream user of a substance on the authorisation list may prepare an application for authorisation for its own use or for the uses for which they intend to place the substance on the EU market. and only representative of a non-EU manufacturer can also submit an application. So, if a substance manufacturer or an importer applies, the authorization can cover the manufacturers or importers' downstream users of the substance for its customers' base. Therefore, these types of upstream applications have full top-down coverage. Now, if a downstream user of the substance, including a formulation containing the substance, applies, the situation is different, and the authorization will have a limited coverage. It will cover the applicant, its customers down the supply chain, and the applicant's immediate supplier one level up the supply chain if this supplier is only placing the substance on the market. The downstream user cannot therefore cover its actors up the supply chain other than the substance manufacturer or the importer if they are its immediate supplier and do not have a use of their own. Downstream users cannot cover their hardware suppliers or processing houses unless they are providing them the substance. Since authorizations cover everyone downstream from the applicant, the further upstream the applicant, the more useful the authorization. However, the broader the application, the more complex it becomes, so there is a trade-off to be made to identify the most appropriate applicant for each application for authorization. For very limited uses confined to a few locations, the end users may well be the most appropriate applicants. However, when there are wide numbers of users and uses across the entire industry, applicants higher up the supply chain may be the most appropriate applicant. For example, a formulator that incorporates the substances into multiple formulations provided throughout the industry. In terms of coverage, distributors don't need to be considered in the authorization chain as they're not substance users. That is, unless they undertake activities such as repackaging substances or formulations. However, they do have a role to play between manufacturers and customers in enabling communication in the supply chain. Under REACH and CLP definitions, it's important to bear in mind that you're not a distributor if you buy chemicals from outside the European Economic Area, the EEA, and place them straight onto the market inside the EEA. In this instance, you're the importer. If you buy chemicals within the EEA and mix them with other chemicals, dilute them or fill containers before supplying them to others, then you're a downstream user and not a distributor. And your own formulation activities may need to be covered in an application for authorization. For complex supply chains such as aerospace, in terms of coverage, authorization often works best when upstream suppliers make the applications, but this requires significant input from end users, original equipment manufacturers, and formulators for this to be a success. In many cases, the best situated upstream applicants may indeed even be the formulators. This all sounds pretty complicated, and quite frankly, it is. Another important point to note is that the REACH authorization process is proving to be constantly evolving because it's complicated and because everyone is learning as we go. Now, ECHA provides a number of templates and guidance materials in relation to authorization. These can also change and aspects of them can become obsolete, and this is the case for some of the information in the original guidance documents which were produced back in 2011. Another example of change concerns the analysis of alternatives and socio-economic analysis, which were initially developed separately but can now be developed in a joint document following a slightly different approach. ECHA's most recent guidance, titled How to Apply for Authorization, was published in October 2017. Also, we earlier mentioned that authorization review periods are typically set to 4, 7, and 12 years. There are ongoing deliberations regarding whether a review period that's longer than this can be granted based on particular exceptional criteria, and many of these criteria have now been defined. Now, the ECHA Committee's approach to evaluating applications is also evolving. For example, since the inception of authorization, we have seen an increase in the type and also the scope of additional conditions and monitoring arrangements added to authorization opinions. And as well as holding regular workshops, ECHA also regularly publishes questions and answers in relation to key authorization issues, and these can, for example, clarify the validity of potential exemptions. So the overall message to take home from this is that given the development of an application can take a considerable length of time, it's really important that applicants keep on top of developments and have a good grasp of the current best practice methods. By now, we have established that authorization is a fairly complicated process. From a business perspective, it requires complete supply chain and product content knowledge, as well as the need to know where all substances used in your activities originate. Authorization also requires businesses to make strategic decisions, and we can usually identify 5 different strategies which you can follow. You can replace a substance with a suitable alternative or adapt your process to avoid its use. You can redesign products, articles, to avoid the use of the substance in the first place. You can consider applying for authorization, joining a consortium to support the applicants. You can also ensure that your use is covered by another application, by somebody else in your supply chain. But here we would like to stress that uses in the context of REACH authorization are often very specific to individual companies, and that it can be very risky to simply rely on someone else to cover your uses because of the high level of specific detail involved. This is why it is critical, if you are relying on someone else to cover your use, that you make them aware fully how you are using the substance and respond to any data calls that they may send. The final option is that you can cease use in the EU. Now, companies really need to weigh up the pros and cons of these options, and to do this properly, it's vitally important to prepare in good time. This is particularly the case for the aerospace industry, where we have a number of complicating factors that mean the need for authorization is often quite great, and the process itself also presents some particular challenges. We'll now look at these challenges in more detail. First and foremost, the industry does depend on many SVHCs in order to meet functional requirements. Airworthiness and safety are a top priority, and high-performance materials and formulations must be used. The safety-critical nature of the industry in turn means that any changes to products require substantive evidence of compliance with standards, and even if achievable, that can take many years. Also, the volume of use of the SVHCs might not be particularly high when considering the overall market for that SVHC. For example, the volume of specialty formulations used by aerospace is often quite low compared to the formulator's overall volumes, potentially resulting in poor business cases for formulators to support the aerospace industry's authorization applications and continued supply of SVHCs. As a consequence, the industry itself must take proactive steps to allow relevant uses to continue. Another really important issue is the complex nature of aerospace supply chains. There's likely to be multiple downstream users and users of a particular SVHC. The nature of uses can be highly variable, and given the many tiers in aerospace supply chains, the level of visibility is often quite poor. As we have already discussed, not every actor in the supply chain can apply for an authorization, but all of the very specific uses must be included in an authorization application for them to be properly covered in the authorization. If we now think about the potential for an upstream application, before we even get to the information required for the CSR, the AOA, and the SEA, we need to know what are the uses. For example, what function does the SVHC perform? Is the SVHC spray, brush, dipped? Is it provided in liquid or solid form? Are potential alternatives available? Are they feasible? How long will they take to implement? Could they be implemented before the sunset date, for example? And who should apply for authorization? The situation is further complicated as not every actor in the supply chain will have the same commercial interests. And it's these issues that really relate to the activities that Workgroup 5 is undertaking. Essentially, we're making efforts to better understand the situation within the supply chains using certain SVHCs. These activities are critical to understanding the vulnerability of downstream user groups to the loss of key substances and to identifying strategies to minimize that vulnerability and increase supply chain resilience. It's also worth mentioning that many of the factors we discuss have been explored in some detail in a 2014 collaboration by ECHA and the European Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, the front cover of which you can see on the slide. This report is available on the ECHA website, and more recently, in December 2017, ECHA and EASA signed a memorandum of cooperation focusing on several activities, including the exchange of information regarding authorization. IEG Workgroup 5 are planning for potential future REACH authorization requirements. To do this, supply chain mapping is critical as it helps us to identify issues which might not be immediately apparent. It also helps us set up communication and potential collaboration channels across affected parts of industry. At present, we're following a four-step approach. Step 1 essentially involves the supply chain profiling of substances as well as an initial assessment of uses. Here, we're really going back to the basics and putting together straightforward use lists and setting out an initial supply chain map. This way, we should be on the right footing moving forward and when trying to gather more complex information about uses. Step 2 is where we get into the detail of developing the supply chain map for the particular substances of concern, and we consult with key actors in the supply chain, such as yourselves. In step 3, we're getting to grips with the risks posed by the potential authorization listing for a certain substance, figuring out how these risks can be mitigated most effectively. Here, we take into account the information we have received from our consultation activities, following up as appropriate, and also undertaking supplementary market analysis on aspects such as potential alternatives, as well as vulnerabilities with respect to supply chain continuity and how this can be affected by the authorization. In step 4, the analysis results in recommendations being made based on whether or not it is believed that aerospace companies will need to continue using the SVHCs after their sunset date. If yes, then a discussion is undertaken regarding the need for an authorization and the best approach for that. In order to get to this critical stage, we need data. The most important information we need is from consultations undertaken by a third-party consultant in order to obtain the direct views of key actors within the supply chain, and that's probably you. With regard to specific SVHCs, at present, the consultants are undertaking a supply chain survey for bisphenol A and the citric acid anhydrides HHPA and MHHPA. BPA and these anhydrides have been included on ECHA's 9th draft recommendation of substances for inclusion in the authorization list, which was published on the 5th of September this year. The recommendation has been subject to a public consultation by both ECHA and the European Commission over the last 3 months. This is the first time that BPA has been included on ECHA's draft recommendations, whereas the anhydrides were originally included on the 7th list, but were dropped after their priority scoring level was reduced due to new information becoming available. So considering timings, given that the substances are currently at the draft recommendation stage, it is very difficult to set a specific date for when they may be subject to authorization requirements. If the substances are included on ECHA's final recommendation, a further vote will ensue at the European Commission level, and this will be followed by scrutiny by the European Council and the European Parliament. Under a theoretical worst-case scenario, and taking into account the various votes, checks, and measures in place, as well as industry guidance on timelines associated with draft recommendations, the substances could reach Annex 14 as early as December 2019. This could lead to a latest application date in May 2021 and a sunset date in December 2022. We emphasise that this is worst case, and in reality the substances may not even reach the authorisation list. However, as preparing an application for authorisation can easily take 18 months or more, we need to be diligent and complete initial supply chain mapping as soon as possible. So, what are our specific concerns regarding BPA and the anhydrides? Well, they're both very well established in critical aerospace applications. BPA is used to produce polycarbonate and epoxy resins, which find extensive use in modern aircraft. Polycarbonate uses include, for example, windows for aeroplanes, light covers, personal protective equipment, electrical insulation, and use in some modern communication equipment. Epoxy resin uses include composite materials for structural components, potting compounds, adhesives, paints, primers, and varnishes, to name a few. A key issue for BPA is that the majority, but not all, of this use is understood to be classed as intermediate and will therefore be exempt from the requirements of authorization. However, before we can begin to look into the nature of intermediate status, we need to be sure that all of the uses of the substance are well understood. To do this, we need more information from the supply chain, particularly relating to the processing steps that occur and the potential for any residual BPA to be present within subsequent polymers. This presents a unique challenge, and we need to gather information on a variety of polymers produced using BPA. This means we need to work even more carefully with our suppliers. Given the complexity of these issues and questions that we have received in relation to BPA during the initial stages of our supply chain mapping, please note that we will be discussing these points in more detail during the live question and answer part of this webinar. For the anhydrides, HHPA and MHHPA, there is a very similar nature of use in epoxy resins. However, as these substances are used extensively in curing applications rather than as applications which are defined as intermediate uses, it is believed that their major uses will indeed be subject to authorization if the substances are listed on Annex 14. The key goal of our mapping exercise for the anhydrides is really for us to gather as much information as possible on the nature and scope of their uses. So for both BPA and the anhydrides, it is therefore vital to us that we are able to build a comprehensive and useful supply chain map. If you currently believe you do not use these compounds, please bear with us. Our experience is that the use of substances in critical products or processes often comes to light unexpectedly with potentially significant implications for individual businesses and the supply chain as a whole. So it is always advisable to participate in supply chain mapping survey activities. We also encourage all of our suppliers to diligently query their suppliers to confirm the presence or absence of HHPA and MHHPA. This is because upstream suppliers may not track these chemicals because they have previously not been considered hazardous. We have designed the survey in several parts because past experience shows that this is the most effective way to work. First, we're disseminating an initial questionnaire. The initial questionnaire focuses on basic information concerning each supplier, confirming whether it uses the substances or formulations containing the substances in question, and verifies that we have correct contact details to follow up on. This should take no more than 10 minutes to complete. We also ask you to forward this questionnaire to your suppliers to complete and encourage them to pass it on to their suppliers and so on. This is critical because some substances may be used further up the supply chain, so we need to try to connect with as many tiers of suppliers as we can. We appreciate this requires some effort on your part, but it brings information that is important for your future viability as well as ours, so we hope you agree the effort is worthwhile. We then send a follow-up questionnaire to all those companies that have confirmed they use the substances. This is slightly more detailed, with approximately 10 questions, and will focus on the identification of particular uses and their associated parameters. It is important to note that the survey activities are not undertaken by IAEG Workgroup 5. They are carried out by third-party consultants, in this case RPA, with the support of Anthesis. This means that all information received is treated confidentially, and in our reporting back to Workgroup 5, survey information is merged and anonymised. This makes certain that no one can link information regarding a particular supply chain back to an individual respondent. RPA and Anthesis are very well versed in the handling of confidential information and will be happy to provide further details if this is required by any company taking part in the survey. So, we hope you have now gained a good understanding of the journey a substance will take onto Annex 14, as well as the challenges facing the aerospace industry and the efforts that IAEG Workgroup 5 is taking to plan for potential future REACH authorization requirements surrounding BPA and the anhydrides, as well as other substances which may be subject to authorization requirements in the future. We really cannot overemphasize how important it is to obtain your support in completing and passing on the short questionnaires that we will be distributing throughout the supply chain and sending your way. Of course, the more information we receive, the better we will be able to determine the key issues, and this will benefit us all in confirming that any eventual authorization application is of the correct scope, well-informed, and based on sound information. Even if you do not use the substances, we appreciate you completing the questionnaire to confirm this is the case. That allows us to have greater certainty about the supply chain mapping. When suppliers do not reply, we cannot assume that they do not use the substance. Instead, we have to consider that as an unknown. When you confirm you don't use a product, we have a much greater confidence in the results. We need effective communication with all our suppliers to provide information and reduce uncertainty about where the substances are used and where they are not used in order to show the regulators that we have a good understanding of the issues facing the aerospace industry, as well as for us to properly assess our own risks. Your input is vital for this. We'd also like to highlight that there are direct benefits for companies that respond to our questionnaires. Most evidently, your input might be critical for you to continue to produce and deliver your products in Europe. In the future, without appropriate authorizations, this may not be the case. We will also keep you updated on the latest developments for these substances, and we will be able to work more closely with you to help alleviate any concerns you may have. This provides an opportunity for you to begin or continue a dialogue with your customers on authorization under REACH. One final point we need to emphasize is that if you are based outside the EU, authorization may still matter to you and your survey input is still very important. For example, if you are based in the United States but export formulations containing a substance on Annex 14 into the EU, the uses inside the EU may still require authorization, and this will present a business risk to you. For the benefit of any company in the aerospace supply chain, whether they be located within or outside the EU, that relies on EU formulators and formulations containing these substances, it is essential we identify and assess the implications of authorization and put in place measures to preserve continuity of supply. Only by working together can we overcome the challenges that are presented by REACH authorization.
Okay, so thank you all for listening to the presentation. I'm now going to pass over to Erin, who will kick off the question and answer session. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tom. We'll now go into the Q&A session. But before we do, I need to remind you of all of the compliance requirements, which we're going to leave on the screen during the entire time that we're doing the Q&A. We have a number of industry experts who are also members of our IAEG REACH authorization work group who are acting as panelists today, and I would like to introduce them before we begin with the actual questions. In addition to myself, who is the chair of the work group, I am also the Engineering REACH Program Manager and Authorization Lead at Pratt & Whitney. We have Alan Thompson, who is my assistant chair of the work group, and he is also a senior engineer for enterprise chemical integration at the Boeing Company. He is accompanied by his colleague Sturla Olsen, who is senior legal counsel with the Boeing Law Department, and Paul Hogben, who is supply chain chemical risk management at Boeing. We have Gwen Gross, associate technical fellow and chief chemist of the composite materials and bonding accelerated material insertion at the Boeing Company. Scott Fetter joins us from Lockheed Martin Aeronautics, and he is the F-35 EH&S lead. Hiba Mooney is the corporate EH&S compliance manager for Northrop Grumman. Tim Sheehan is compliance and risk manager for the Raytheon Global Substances Program, and his colleague Jeff Bradford, who is the materials and process engineer for Raytheon Global Substances Program. In addition to the Workgroup 5 members, we also have panelists today from our technical consultants. From RPA, we have Meg Postal, who is a director at RPA, and Tom Persick, who has so kindly done all of this work for us, who is a senior consultant for chemicals. They are joined by Helen Keene from Anthesis, who is a technical director. And without further ado, let's begin with some of the questions. I would like to remind you that as we are going through some of these initial questions and responses, you are very free to use your question box on your webinar screen and send additional questions you may have to Tom during this time. So the first question we have is, where and how are these substances used, and which uses are likely to be exempt from authorization? Gwen, would you like to take that question for us?
I'm happy to. Can everyone hear me this morning? Erin?
Yes, you're fine.
All right. So as I covered in the presentation, BPA is predominantly used in the production of various advanced polymeric and composite materials, with known core uses being in the production of polycarbonate and epoxy resins. For BPA, our initial research has indicated that the vast majority of uses in the aerospace industry are likely to be classed as intermediate uses and should be exempt from the authorization requirement This is certainly the case for the production of polycarbonate. For the epoxy resins, we understand the use of BPA is in the production of the bisphenol A diglycetyl ether, which you may commonly know as BADG or DGEBA. It's an organic compound. It's a constituent of a lot of epoxy resins. Again, this use would be classified as an intermediate use, but we're also aware that there are additional additive uses of BPA in epoxies, as instances where substances use it as a curing agent. We know that curing agents are considered to be within scope for the authorization, but what we don't know at the moment is the extent of BPA's use in that role. And so that's one aspect of what we're hoping to find out with the supply chain mapping. For the anhydrides, the situation's a little more clear because we know that the predominant use of that substance is as a curing agent in various types of epoxy resins. Examples would include insulations, encapsulations, fillers, some adhesive products, as well as the composites. We understand that these substances are used as process regulators in polymer production, so we believe that those uses are going to be within scope of the authorization.
Thank you very much, Gwen. The next question is an authorization required for unreacted BPA in a reaction product contained in a formulation I use? For example, potential unreacted BPA in a BPA epichlorohydrin blend, which you will often see if you look on your safety data sheet. You will see that as one of your entries. Helen, could you answer this for us?
Sure. Good morning or good afternoon to the attendees. So this is certainly a very important question, and I think it's very important to try to understand why the BPA is there. The thermostats industry position is that resins are mixtures of polymers and monomers and therefore are not eligible for consideration as SVHCs. The industry is actually arguing that in a reactive resin mixture, unreactive monomers have a defined technical function in that they're available for polymerization or further polymerization and should be considered as substances in their own right within the resin mixture. When the polymerization process is complete, the monomer no longer has a technical function, and at that time the residual monomer should be considered to be an impurity in the polymer substance. As it stands, if the concentration of the BPA residual monomer impurity is below the 0.1%, this will not impact on the classification of the polymer. If, however, the concentration is above 0.1%, this would impact the treatment of the polymer itself, with potential for that polymer being within the scope of authorization. However, it's important to note that there are other factors that are coming into play. These include some uncertainties surrounding statements recently made by ECHA in the Board of Appeal decision. So during this scoping study, we will certainly be undertaking further research into the need for an authorization and may even reach out to member states or the ECHA help desks for further clarity if this is felt necessary.
Thank you very much. The next question, how do I know if my products contain BPA or the anhydrides? Scott, can you perhaps answer that for us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. We think we have a good idea of the core use for these substances. For instance, the polycarbonate epoxy resins for BPA and the anhydrides used in epoxy resins in polymer processing. So if you're curious about which one of your products contain BPA, a good start is always checking Section 3 of a safety data sheet of the potentially relevant product that you use. Each of the substances of concern has one or more CAS numbers or EC numbers if you're in the EU that are shown in the safety data sheet for that identification. However, as you may know, if you have any experience doing this, there is ample evidence that the CAS numbers of a lot of these products might not be shown in the safety data sheet. We have certainly found this to be the case in a lot of the other safety data sheets for the other chemicals that are being assessed by ECHA. So it's vital that you discuss the content of your products with your suppliers, subject matter experts, in other words, the manufacturers of the products. We would recommend that you not just talk to a local salesperson, that you find a subject matter expert who is knowledgeable in your product and exactly what is used in your product, so you can determine whether they truly have BPA or anhydride, and also with regards to the question of whether it's an intermediate or not, what the company's position on it being an intermediate in, for instance, the residual or an unreacted portion. So also keep in mind that the issue applies to formulations that you use in the European Union and not to articles that are imported into the European Union.
Thank you, Scott. So as a user of BPA, HHPA, or MHHPA, is there anything that I need to be doing now? Well, we would very much appreciate you answering the IAEG survey, which you will be receiving shortly, being sent by RPA, and then begin to assess your inventory to determine if you and your company have any uses. We also request that you pass the survey down to your own suppliers and perhaps begin discussions with your customers regarding your uses, particularly if they're the ones that are requiring the use of that substance in your manufacturing processes. A follow-on question to that is, why have BPA and the anhydrides been included on the 9th draft recommendation? Alan, would you answer that for all of us, please?
Sure. Yep. So first of all, let's address the context. ECHA typically runs a public consultation on the recommendation once a year. Its selection of the candidate list substances is primarily based on information and registration dossiers on uses and volumes of substances considered to be in the scope of authorization. Specific concerns with bisphenol A are surrounding reprotoxic properties, as well as concerns over endocrine disruption for human health and the environment. And this is the first time that bisphenol A has been included in one of ECHA's draft recommendations. Situation's a little bit different for the anhydrides, which have concerns over respiratory sensitizing properties. Both HHPA and MHHPA were originally included in the 7th draft recommendation and underwent a 3-month public consultation, which finished in 2016. Due to new information submitted during that public consultation, the substances received a lower relative priority for inclusion in Annex 14 and weren't considered for further inclusion in the final 7th recommendation. However, ECHA now says that in comparison to the substances assessed for the 9th draft recommendation, that these anhydrides were concluded as being of high priority for inclusion in Annex 14, and this is why they are currently undergoing another 3-month public consultation.
Excellent. Hopefully that makes things clearer for people. Thank you, Alan. The next question we have is, how will I know that my use of BPA or the anhydrides is covered by my upstream supply chain, and what obligation will I have towards my customers? Paul, that's a supply chain question. Why don't we have you try to answer that for us?
It sounds good. So I would say that you will need to check with your chemical suppliers. So first of all, to be covered by an upstream application, you'll need to ensure that the substance or substances you are using originate from an authorization applicant. You'll also need to ensure that the description of the applied for uses and the risk management measures and operational conditions within the relevant authorization application match your specific processes. Then, after authorization is granted, the upstream holders of an authorization will be obliged to comply with the requirements of the decision and must include the authorization number on the label and in the safety data sheet before they place the substance on the market. Finally, you as a downstream user of an authorized substance will also need to comply with the decision and notify ECHA of your use of the substance within 3 months of the first supply of that substance. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Paul. The next question I'm going to give to RPA and Tom. The question is, how long does the overall survey process take, and how much of my time will it take?
Okay, thanks, Erin. So the first thing I would say is that the survey process has been designed to try and minimise the input that you have to give. As we mentioned in the presentation, there's two steps to the survey. The first part, it should only take a few minutes to complete, and that part basically involves confirming whether you're part of the supply chain for the substances or not, and then asks you to provide some relevant follow-up contact details. The second survey seeks more detail on the use of the substances. The time to complete there will really depend on the number of uses you have, but it shouldn't take longer than 15 minutes if you have information regarding your uses to hand. RPA and Anthesis, we will both be available to answer any questions you may have as you complete the surveys, and we really want to try and make it as easy as possible and as pain-free as possible for you to participate. Well, in summary, really, the most important thing is that you engage in this process so that we are aware of your involvement in the supply chain, and so that Workgroup 5 can essentially plan accordingly.
Thanks, Tom. And if I could just reiterate that even if you do not have uses of any of these substances, it is still very important to us that you respond back and tell us that, so that we're not uncertain whether we just didn't receive your response. We are keeping track of all of these, both positive and negative responses for our future work. I do have a very important follow-on question, Tom, for you that I think everyone will want to hear the answer. And it's, how do you guarantee that information is kept confidential when undertaking the supply chain mapping activities?
Yeah, and I can see we've had a couple of people submitting questions on that point. So essentially, RPA and Anthesis are acting as third-party independent consultants in this exercise. So put simply, we're responsible for ensuring that all information received from the supply chain is collated, it's anonymized, and then reported back in an aggregated format to Workgroup 5 so that individual respondent information cannot be deciphered. So we would certainly like to reassure all potential participants to the survey that both RPA and Anthesis are very well versed in the collection and anonymization of confidential information. This set of supply chain mapping activities is our fifth for Workgroup 5, and we have a set of procedures and checks in place to make sure that confidentiality is respected. It's always a top priority, and I'd really urge anyone with any more concerns on confidentiality to just contact me directly, and I can give you more information.
Thank you, Tom. And to add to that, confidentiality is a critical concern of IAEG and all of our members. And so we take this very seriously and ensure that the consultants that we hire to act as third parties for us have very strict protocols to ensure that this occurs. IAEG Workgroup 5 has been working with RPA for several years now. I'm not sure what number, but we have launched several of these supply chain mapping surveys to suppliers such as yourselves, and we have never had an issue with confidentiality in any of those surveys. The next question is, isn't it the responsibility of the substance manufacturer to make sure that our uses are covered? Paul, could you answer that?
Yeah, I would say that it's not. No, if you want to continue using a substance that's subject to authorization, it's simply your own responsibility to make sure that your uses will be covered.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. I'm using BPA, HHPA, and MHHPA, and I don't know if there are any alternatives available. How can I find out? Scott, would you like to try to answer that one?
Sure. Thanks, Erin. Well, it's really a two-part question. The first question you have to ask yourself is, assuming you're not exempt from the authorization, are you actually covered? Are you going to be impacted? Do you have a product that's going to be impacted by this restriction? So if you are not exempt and you are going to be impacted, then the second question you have to ask is, are you in charge of the design that's used of the hardware using the use of this using this substance? If you are the design authority and you have the ability to make changes, then the first step you should take is to do your own research by asking your supplier of your product if they have an alternative. We found that most of our suppliers are well aware of these chemicals moving towards authorization, and in most cases have been working for alternatives. And so they may already have an alternative product that's either in development or close to qualification that you can consider. So obviously contacting your suppliers, or if you have an OEM that has that kind of knowledge, is a good starting point. Obviously, qualification and certification for your specific hardware must always be successfully completed before substitution is made, especially in the aerospace industry. So if you're not the design authority of the hardware and you're basically, say, a build-to-print supplier, you've got to go and work with your customer or your purchasing folks to query if they are aware of an alternative or if they are already working on qualifying an alternative material. And then you obviously have to work with them to make sure the alternative meets the design performance requirements for your hardware and has been fully qualified and certified. Okay?
All right, thanks very much, Scott. Looks like we're really beginning to come up to the top of the hour. So Tom, would you like, I think you had a couple of questions that came into you that you might want to speak about here before we close up.
Yeah, that's great. So to those people who have submitted questions that we haven't been able to answer directly, I'll get in touch with you after the webinar. So I'll provide you a direct response.
All right, thanks very much. And at this point, I would like to thank all of you for attending, and also to all of our panelists for their input, and Tom Persick of RPA for facilitating this event for us. A recording of the webinar will be made available soon on the IAG Workgroup 5 website. Tom, will we be able to send out an email to the participants when we're able to get that uploaded?
Yeah, sure, that wouldn't be a problem.
Excellent. Also, if you could send feedback on this webinar to Tom Persick, this would be very much appreciated. Tom's contact details can be found in your original webinar invitation emails. And as we do these rather routinely as part of our supply chain mapping exercises of REACH SVHCs, we really would appreciate your feedback because we'd like to improve on what we do in the future. So any comments or suggestions are greatly appreciated. Many of you will be receiving our supply chain survey on BPA, HHPA, and MHHPA, and I would very much like to encourage you to respond. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.